Hello and welcome everybody to Building Web Applications with Shiny and SQL. So in this part we're going to talk about the backend portion of the application. So just taking a look at the tables we have here on SQLite. Basically two tables. This is just a sample application. So I have a table called Six Sig Proj, which has the project information. So the Six Sigma project ID, project name, project description, the sponsor ID, the champion ID, and loss function data, which is a blob if the user wants to save the data from his loss function analysis. On the users table, basically I have user ID, username, and role. And these tables, the user table is linked to the sponsor ID and the champion ID, where it looks up the username from this table to this table. Okay. So looking into the Server.R file now, which is responsible for the logic of your application, as I explained in the last video. We are going to start by looking at defining some important constants. Okay, so before I actually start the server-side script, I define this project, which is called Proj Register Fields, and this is going to be a constant with all the name of all the controls for which you want to gather data in a specific form and save that data into a database. So our form is very simple. It has the controls proj name, proj description, sponsor ID, and champion ID. Okay, so I just put the name of these columns in a list, let's say, called Proj Register Field. This is going to be important, and we're going to see a little bit further down the line why. Okay, so this is where actually the server side file gets started. You call this function Shiny Server. Notice that it creates three objects: input, output, and session. The input is a list that describes all the text ID, text fields, list fields, all the input objects that you defined in the UI.R file. Okay. The output is going to contain a list of every object you want to output some kind of some kind of result into that object, right? And then the session basically controls your web session, right? So the next thing we need to define, if you're using MySQL, need to define this set of parameters, which is what you're going to use to log into your MySQL file. So basically I create a list called options that has host equal to localhost, port. I define the user and the password, and create this list called options. Okay. So the next thing, if you want to connect to a MySQL database, you're going to use this set of commented lines here. I'm using SQLite, so I'm actually connecting through this method here. But it's very simple, very similar. I set my database name to Six Sigma SH, and then I do a DB. This is going to contain your connection to the database, and I call DB connect MySQL, and then set the DB name to this database name, and then I call each of the parameters on the list that we created, the options list. So options, MySQL host, options, MySQL port, so on and so forth. Okay. For SQLite, it's much simpler. You just define the path, and that points to, in my case, the www directory in the Shiny IO server. I use a relative path here. So it's going to look for that file on the subdirectory www of the current directory. And then I set DB as a connection to that, an SQLite connection to that path. Okay. So here on item 5 is where I load this drop down. Okay. So I create a list data variable that basically contains the result of an SQL query that looks for the names of all the projects in the Six Sigma table. So let's look how this works. Okay, so I call this function load data. Load data receives the field names, which are the project name and the Six Sigma project ID. Notice that the quote includes both fields, right? And it looks for those fields in the table Six Sigma Proj, and it sorts by project name. Okay, so let's look at what list data does. I'm sorry, what load data? Fine. So list data receives the result of load data. Let's look at load data. So load data again receives the fields, the table name, if there's a sorting column and a where clause. So in our case, we don't have a where clause for that particular call. So it skips this, right, and it builds a query using this this command that basically it takes a string with some placeholders and it plugs whatever you put, whatever comes after the string into those placeholders. So I receive the field name, it just goes select fields, whatever fields I put in, I pass to the function, from table, and in our case we don't have a where clause, so it's doing this part here, right? And then I just call this method db_get_query. I pass the connection and the query string that I just built. If I have a sort field, I'm sorting actually the resulting data frame rather than sorting on the query. I could do that. I was just exploring, felt it was interesting to just sort the result using this order command from R. Okay, so I take DataDB and order by the sort column that's passed to the load data function, and then I return if there's a sorting column, I return this DataDB. If there isn't, this gets returned, right? So load data gets all the project names sorted by, gets project names and Sigma IDs ordered by project name, right? And then here all I'm doing is adding the option none, and associated with that option none, I associate the ID 0. And that's another way if the client or the user wants to add a blank or a new project, he can go to none. For example, I called something here, I can go to none and add a new record. It's the same thing as clicking the new button here. Okay, so all this line does is add none and 0 to the top of this list. Okay, then what this set names command does is it's because here I have a data frame and this data frame has titles, right? So this project list set names basically strips the header titles from that list data data frame. Okay, and then what it gets this what this command does is builds, let's say, the Six Sigma project ID with this project list that we just built. Okay, so this render UI, that's what it takes whatever is inside here, executes the command and passes on to the output. Remember I mentioned about this output list, the object Six Sigma project ID in this output list. And remember that the location in this object was defined over in the UI.R like we explained in the last video. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is this load data function. Okay, and I think just to keep it in context, load data. Oh, we talked about this already. 6, so 7. So the next thing is to learn how to when the new button gets clicked, right? How to clear all the inputs in the form, right? And for that, you're going to need that session object that gets created when you start the server script. Okay, so what's going on is this observe event. When you create this observe event command, it's gonna keep watching for any changes on the new rec button, right? So if that button gets clicked, this observe event gets triggered, right? And then it executes everything that's in these brackets here, right? So what does it do? It just clears, sets, right? Sets Six Sigma ID to value empty, Six Sigma ID project to value empty, and all of these fields just sets them to empty strings. Okay. So then the user goes, types, and he clicks on the types the new values, and we're gonna see later he can click on the update button, and that gets saved. So what we saw here is the new button, right? We saw this. So when we click on new, all it does is clears all the buttons, all the inputs that we have in the form. Okay, and again, the trick here is to use this session object to point to each of the controls that you have in the form. Okay. So now let's look at the delete operation. Okay. Again, I have an observe event that's watching out for when the delete rec button gets clicked. Once this is clicked, what's in the brackets gets executed. All right, it's going to go up to here actually. Okay, so I put this in between a try catch, because what could happen is someone else deletes the record and the record is no longer available, and you get an error if that happens. So I place the delete actions, right, delete functions that I'm going to talk to you guys about in a try catch error handler. Okay, so when that gets triggered, it calls this function delete catch, right? And delete catch receives a table and a where clause, right? So the table name is Six Sigma project, and the where clause, I use the paste function to basically say where Six Sigma project ID equals the value in the Six Sig project ID text input, right? And what does delete data do? So delete data receives the table and the where clause, and it just builds again a query, right? Using the sprintf, kind of like we saw before. Delete from the table name where the where clause, and the where clause says where project ID equals whatever the number for the whatever number is displayed here. Okay. And builds the query, and again calls db get query, which executes the query in the database file. Okay. So after after I actually delete the data, I have to reload the dropdown because one of the projects is going to disappear from this list. So I call load dropdown, right? Load dropdown receives the fields, the table, the sort by, and the ID field. So the field is the project name and the Six Sigma project ID. Again, remember that this is one parameter. Notice where the quotes are, right? The table is Six Sigma Proj. The sort by is I'm sorting by project name. And the ID field for this dropdown is going to be Six Sigma project ID. I'm going to stop this video here for now because I just realized that it's 22 minutes long. If this is being useful to you, please don't forget to like and subscribe. This will give me an incentive to keep recording these series. If you have any suggestions or questions, please, you're welcome to leave them in the comments below. And I will see you in the next video.